Good evening. I'm David Haynes, editor of the Ideas Lab at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Welcome to this special program co-sponsored by the Ideas Lab and the Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Tonight, I'll be chatting with Catherine Rampell, a columnist with the Washington Post. Catherine is a political and economic commentator as well for CNN and a special correspondent for PBS NewsHour. She's also a regular on Marketplace on public radio, and she's made appearances on many other venues. Before joining the Post, Catherine was a reporter and editor for the New York Times, and she produced and edited the blog Economics. Now, the program tonight is part of a very full week at La Follette. The school's annual spring program is Wednesday at Monona Terrace in Madison. You can still register to attend in person, or you can attend virtually. The whole show will be live streamed. The program, La Follette Forum, American Power, Prosperity, and Democracy, will touch on a range of public policy issues. And if you have any interest at all in public policy as it relates to Wisconsin, I'd urge you to attend. To register, go to go.wisc.edu/La Follette Forum. And now let me welcome Catherine Rampell. Catherine, thanks for being with us.
Great to join you.
And so I wondered if you would talk, first of all, about how you got into journalism, because I don't think that's what you were studying in college.
I knew from a very young age that I wanted to be a journalist, probably since I was sometime in elementary school. I remember I created a little school newspaper for my, I think it was third or fourth grade class, called Nosy News. Did not last very long, but it was a valiant effort. So I knew that I wanted to be a journalist. I really liked writing. I loved talking to people, interviewing people. And I did a lot of internships in high school and in college, which turned out to be quite helpful in a really competitive industry like this one. So I knew I wanted to go into this industry. My university didn't have a journalism major. And actually, I think my usual advice to students today who want to become journalists is you don't need to major in journalism. Maybe you should major in journalism. You should major in something else that'll give you some relevant expertise that will set you apart from other job candidates. But learn how to report and write or edit, cut video, audio, make graphics, that sort of thing. And if you're going to journalism school, to get those tools, you should still try to develop some other area of subject matter expertise anyway. So for me, I tried to get the experience that I needed to through internships and that sort of thing. And that turned out to be very helpful.
And so where did the interest in the economy and economics come from?
In college, I was a research assistant for an economist, a man named Alan Kruger, who at the time, I guess I didn't realize quite how significant he was. He was just my boss. I really liked working for him, but he was kind of a big deal, and I didn't appreciate it at the time. He had worked for the Clinton administration, as I believe his title was chief economist at the Labor Department. He had done a lot of really significant research on the minimum wage, as well as some other areas where he kind of pioneered some interesting techniques that are not pioneered, refined, I guess I should say, techniques that are called natural experiments, finding novel instrumental variables to try to test interesting policy ideas and questions within the field. And then, so I worked for him in college, kind of unrelated actually to my journalistic interests, but he was a smart guy and a good boss and did really compelling work. So, and he gave me a job. So that's how I first got involved with that. And then years later, after I had worked for him, the New York Times was looking to hire someone to start an economics blog. And the then economics columnist at the Times emailed a bunch of economics professors that he knew and said, do any of you know any journalists who know something about this subject matter? And at the time, there weren't that many. That has since changed of necessity, thanks to the financial crisis and other major national and global events. But at the time, there weren't that many. And my former boss gave the Times my name and said, I think my former RA is working as a journalist and might be worth talking to. So that's how they got my name and interviewed me and put me through the ringer and all of that. And I worked hard and everything, but to some extent, it was largely luck that got me into that job, got me that connection, got me into that job at basically exactly the right moment to be an economics journalist, because it was around the time that the financial crisis was happening. So that's how those two kind of worlds of mine ended up intersecting.
Right. And just briefly, you've done some theater criticism as well. So tell me about that.
When I was at the Times, as you said, my main job was writing about the economy, but I loved theater. I did a lot of theater in college, wrote for our student amateur theatrical group and performed with it, and kind of kept up with it just as a hobby. While I was at the Times, I approached the theater editor and I said, hey, do you need another critic? I'm happy to freelance for you. Here's some of my clips from an internship, because I had done an internship where I was working for the theater editor at the Village Voice. This was, I think the Village Voice has since failed and been revived, but it used to be a relatively well-known alt weekly here in New York City.
Yeah.
And so I gave the editor some clips, and he tried me out and liked me and kind of put me in the rotation. So to be clear, I was not reviewing Broadway shows. I was reviewing off-Broadway and off Broadway shows, little shows, that the top theater critics were not fighting over. But it was fun. It was really fun.
Still a great experience. So I want you to talk a little bit about how you approach doing journalism. My sense is that in reading your column over the years, that you really rely on data and to sort of figure out what's going on before you draw a conclusion. Just talk a little bit about your approach to looking at data, analyzing data before you write.
I certainly aspire to do that, yes. I write an opinion column, so I have to have an argument, I have to have a thesis, and obviously, like everyone else, I have my own biases. So there are lots of policy questions, lots of, major news stories on which I'm going to come to a subject with some priors, with some preconceived notions. But I try to figure out what are the relevant data, particularly when I'm writing about the economy. What are the relevant data sets that I can use to figure out if I'm right, to figure out, or if I don't have a hypothesis going in, to figure out what's actually going on. So, like, for example, I write a lot about the job market. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out oodles and oodles of various data sets, data series on what's happening in the job market. So every month, and this Friday will be the next time this happens. Every month, the Labor Department, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, puts out its monthly jobs report, and then you can kind of dig in and you can see what industries were adding jobs, what industries were shedding jobs and laying off workers, or where were people quitting, what's happening to people of different ages, different education levels, different races. Do they have kids? Do they not have kids? Where in the country are they? Not all of that comes out at once. It doesn't all come out on Friday, but over the course of the month, you get a lot of these pieces of the puzzle. And if you know your way around the website, if you know your way around, analyzing some of these data sets, you can find interesting patterns. You can find things that surprise you about what's happening with employment, what's happening with different, what's happening to different kinds of workers, different kinds of industries. So going into that monthly jobs report, the night before, I'll start to think about, well, what kinds of themes might I end up writing about tomorrow? What are people interested in? And sometimes the thing that I think is going to happen is borne out. It's a great jobs report, or it's a terrible jobs report, or whatever. And sometimes I'm completely wrong, and I have to spend all morning figuring out what's actually going on. Why did the number go down, or why did it go up? And those are often the most fun jobs report days, when I'm just surprised by everything and I have to kind of sift through the data and figure out, what the actual mechanics are, and what I should be paying attention to, and what I think the rest of what my readers and the
Hmm.
general public should be paying attention to. So I spend a lot of time working with these big data sets, um, and that's just one example. And sometimes, I just come across something that's interesting and I'll sift through it, and that'll give me an idea for an interesting story, an interesting column to write. And other times, there'll be some question that I'm looking into, and then I go out and hunt for what are the numbers that either could shed light on this issue or help me better understand, um, ways to think about the ramifications of a policy that's been proposed or a policy that's already been implemented. Whether it's about labor markets, inflation, taxes, budgets, immigration. So I do try to spend a lot of time familiarizing myself with these data sets because they're often very valuable. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of journalists who, and I think this is changing to some extent, but historically, there are not a lot of journalists who are comfortable with numbers. And so I feel like my comparative advantage to some extent is that I am. I mean, I'm not a mathematician, but in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Um, and so I am pretty comfortable, working with these numbers and calling the civil servants or other experts who might be more familiar with the data than I am, who can help me understand what's being measured, how it's being measured. Does this data set actually capture the answer to the question that I'm looking at? Maybe it looks like it does, but it turns out there's some wacky technical reason why it doesn't.
Right.
So,
Right.
um,
That sort of discovery that happens as we report is often just one of the most fun things about our journalism, right?
yes,
We
yes.
find things we didn't expect to find. I want to move to a few issues. I want to talk first about the risk of a recession. You wrote about this recently. You said that the risk seems higher now, in part because we needed to have everything go right, and a lot of things haven't gone right in the last few months. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how concerned should we be, do you think, at this point about a recession over the next few months or into next year?
Um, so it's always a fool's errand to make a hard and fast prediction like this, that when the business cycle will turn. I will say I have gotten more pessimistic. I don't think that a recession is inevitable in the next year or so, but I think it has gotten more likely than it was a few months ago, or at least than I perceived the risks to be a few months ago. And that's for a few different reasons. One is that, as you said, we've gotten pretty unlucky with a number of really bad, unwelcome supply shocks in the past few months, or even really in the past year. Obviously, we're still recovering from the major disruption to the global economy, amongst other things, that is COVID, that roiled supply chains, that changed people's priorities, took people out of the workforce, led a lot of people to retire, changed migration patterns, everything else. So we really needed for the economy to normalize to some extent as things reopened, as we got vaccines, as schools reopened and parents were able to go back to work. And some of that has happened, but not nearly as much as I think many of us expected or at least hoped a year ago, partly because we got more COVID variants, vaccine take-up hasn't been as strong as maybe some people might have thought a year ago, et cetera. So you have all of those COVID issues. Lately, you have a series of COVID-related lockdowns in China, where they have this zero tolerance policy. They've locked down major manufacturing hubs like Shanghai and Shenzhen, where factories are shuttered. It's even if a product has some kind of consumer product, that, like, there are a lot of electronics, for example, that are made in Shenzhen. Even if they are able to be produced, can they get trucked to wherever they need to go, to the port, et cetera? So that has continued to disrupt supply chains. On top of that, obviously, you have the war in Ukraine, whose main important consequence I emphasize is the loss of life. But beyond that, you've obviously had a number of disruptions to energy markets, to food markets. I think we're likely to see mass starvation in some of the lower income countries that rely on Ukraine and Russia for wheat and corn and some other food products. But you're going to have consequences here in the United States as food prices go up. In the UK, they've already had rationing at supermarkets on cooking oil in part because Ukraine is historically a major global supplier of sunflower oil. And that whole supply chain has been disrupted, metals, things like that. So you have these major disruptions, which had not been predicted a year ago, obviously, from the war, from China. And then you have like a whole bunch of other random things that have been unhelpful. You have an avian flu here in the United States that's driven up the cost of eggs already. There's a drought in California. So it's just like one thing after another. And we really needed things to go right, particularly since inflation has been increasing. The main tool available to deal with inflation, to bring pricing pressures down, is the Fed's interest rate tool. That basically the Fed raises interest rates, which drive up the cost of borrowing, makes it a little bit more expensive to buy a car or a house or things you put on your credit card, et cetera. So that would tamp down demand. They've been kind of slow at responding to the inflationary threat, in part because, like many of us, including myself, they were too optimistic about inflation over the past year. And now that inflation has been running higher and we've had all of these unlucky shocks, meaning that inflation will likely stay elevated, the Fed has to be much more aggressive at raising interest rates in order to be effective at getting inflation down. And that can have a side effect. And raising interest rates is one of these medicines that can accidentally kill the patient. And historically, that's what's happened, which is that when the Fed has raised interest rates to get inflation under control, it's raised them a little too much and tipped us into a recession. That's happened almost every time the Fed has had to do this. And the Fed, for example, Fed Chair Jay Powell has talked about the desire for a so-called soft landing, the idea that, well, maybe they can raise interest rates just enough to tamp down inflation, but not so much that we get into a recession. And that was always going to be tricky. Like I said, historically, they haven't been able to do that. It's even harder now because inflation has been running so hot, because we've gotten, these unfortunate shocks, unforeseen shocks. So it's a long-winded way of saying that some poor policy choices, some unlucky shocks, and things like that are all combining, unfortunately, to raise the risk of recession over the next year or so. And it doesn't mean it's definitely going to happen, but it's really hard to figure out the path the Fed can take, this Goldilocks path where they get interest rate hikes.
The brakes.
Yeah, exactly. Tap the brakes, but not slam on them. It's going to be hard.
Yeah. So this is a question that I'd love to have your take on. I think presidents often get more credit and more blame than they deserve for the economy. I recall back in 1992 when George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush, was running for re-election. We were in recession in the early part of his campaign. By the time, by election day, we didn't know it, but we were out of recession. He got blamed for that, and that was one of the reasons that he didn't win that year, and that Bill Clinton won. There were other reasons too. But I wonder, in this case, the Republicans are trying very hard to pin the economy, inflation, what's happening on Joe Biden and the Biden administration. In your view, how much responsibility does the administration have?
So you are speaking my language. My mantra is always the president gets too much blame for a good economy, too much credit for a good economy, too much blame for a bad economy. And, actually, I'm tentatively titling my talk later this week at the forum, "The Biden Economy, Sort of," because I always feel a little weird talking about the Trump economy or the Biden economy because it suggests more ownership or responsibility than is actually possible. Um, I don't think President Biden controls gas prices or grocery prices or the price of used cars or anything else. Um, I don't think he is unilaterally responsible for the good things in the economy either, although he deserves some credit. We have had stronger job growth, which I haven't mentioned, than had been predicted a year ago, more than a year ago when he came into office. So there are a number of things that are different from what people had forecast early on, and some of that is due to policy choices that Biden has made. I do think it's fair to say that the choices that Biden and Democrats in Congress have made have probably nudged inflation higher on the margin and have probably nudged job growth higher on the margin as well. Basically, Biden and the Democrats passed this massive stimulus bill last year in March of 2021, the American Rescue Plan. And it did a lot of things that I think were really good and really important, including expanding the child tax credit and providing rental relief. But there was some bloat in it as well. There were these universal checks that went, I should say near universal checks that went out to almost every household, including households that really didn't need the assistance, who maybe even had come out financially ahead as a result of the pandemic because they had saved a lot of money, sort of forced savings while they weren't going out and traveling and things like that. Their house gained value, so their net worth went up, and they may have even gotten a raise at work. White collar workers who didn't lose their jobs, et cetera. They did well. They did okay financially. I realized there were other stresses of the pandemic. Financially, they did well. They didn't need the assistance. There were a lot of people in that situation. There's a lot of funding that went out to state and local governments that at the time I thought would be necessary because of what happened after the Great Recession, when state and local governments were basically broke. And as a result, took a really long time to rehire people who had been laid off. It took a long time to rebuild services that had been pared back during the recession. It seemed like states and localities might be in the same situation once again. In retrospect, that was sort of fighting the last war. The nature of this most recent recession, the one caused by COVID, was very different. And the impact on state and local governments was very different. Many of them saw their tax revenues go up because of what got taxed. For example, sales tax revenues went up if higher income workers were disproportionately keeping their jobs, and the state has a progressive income tax. The lower income workers were losing their jobs. For unfortunate reasons, income tax revenues might have held up well or even gone up because the lower income workers probably weren't paying that much in income taxes to begin with. So in any event, state and local governments didn't need as much aid as they got. And I think some evidence of that is that you're seeing a lot of states cutting taxes right now. They got like this one-time infusion of cash from the federal government, from these weird dynamics from the pandemic and the recession, and they don't need the money. They're returning the cash to taxpayers. So all of those things mean that more people have cash in their pockets that they're able to spend at exactly the same time that supply chains, are still messed up, and producers can't ramp up output as quickly as they want to, or customers want them to, I should say. So yes, those policy choices have contributed to inflationary pressures, but they are not the only thing that's going on. I mean, if you look at what's happened in most other developed economies around the world, in the UK and the EU and elsewhere, they are also experiencing very high inflation, above trend inflation, for many of these same reasons. And they didn't pass the American Rescue Plan, right? The United States actually had a much more aggressive fiscal response, and not just through the American Rescue Plan, but through the several rounds of aid passed under Trump as well, and the
Right.
CARES Act, amongst others. So those other countries are also experiencing inflation, and they didn't do quite as much as we did. So it's partly these policies, it's partly these weird dynamics coming out of the pandemic. And as I said, it's like a series of shocks that we've had since then. So I don't want to let Biden and the Democrats off the hook entirely for choices that have been made, including some choices that I supported, by the way. I need to be transparent about that. That in retrospect, I think may have been misguided. I don't want to let them off the hook entirely, but I also don't think that they deserve 100% of the blame, or even maybe 80% of the blame for the fact that inflation is really painful right now.
So another question about inflation in just a second, but let me remind you that you're watching a special program, a conversation with Catherine Rampell of the Washington Post. It's sponsored by the Ideas Lab at the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and the Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you can still sign up for the spring forum. Just go to go.wisc.edu/LaFollette Forum. That's on Wednesday. It's both in person at Monona Terrace and also virtual. Now, Catherine, let me ask you about the politics of inflation. You wrote recently that you thought that the Democrats were kind of in denial about inflation as a problem. Maybe with the possible exception of Larry Summers, but they were in denial. Are they still?
I think they've moved on from denial. Actually, my column that I think is online now, that'll be in tomorrow's paper, is about how Democrats have been moving sort of through the 5 stages of grief on inflation, the first of which is denial. And for a very long time, Biden officials, as well as Democratic members of Congress and left-leaning pundits, I think, kind of refused to believe that inflation was a problem, or at least was as much of a problem as poll data showed, as media coverage suggested. And early on, I think this was perhaps a reasonable take that, look, we have some weird stuff happening in the economy right now. Like I'm thinking early last year, a large part of the increase in inflation, I want to say in the spring, early summer of last year, was about used car prices. And there was some strange idiosyncratic stuff happening in the used car market because like the rental companies had sold all of their cars during the pandemic and suddenly needed a lot of cars, et cetera. So it's like, well, there's some idiosyncratic stuff happening. It's isolated to a few, or relatively isolated to a few different categories of spending. It's not broad-based. It'll be transitory. Remember that word, transitory? Yeah. So I think early on, it was reasonable to say, let's not panic about this. In fact, I wrote, don't panic about inflation yet, sometime in the first half of last year. But as the year went on, it became clearer that no, supply chains were not normalizing. No, consumers were not paring back on their demand for appliances and sports equipment and all of the other goods that people had shifted their consumption bundle toward, away from services. They were, rather than paying for a gym membership, they were buying sporting equipment. Rather than going out to brunch at their local restaurant, they were buying a waffle iron for their house, etc. It looked like those trends would change, and then they just didn't. And consumer demand was really strong, particularly for the things that were having the most trouble getting through these global supply chains and shipped across oceans and through our ports, et cetera. And it was becoming much broader based. And through as recently as I want to say the fall of last year, there were a lot of Democrats and kind of left-leaning pundit types who were in denial about the underlying trends themselves, how much people cared about them. I remember seeing a lot of people say, oh, it's just like Republicans and right-wing media, Fox News, et cetera, pretending that inflation is a big problem, or at least exaggerating the worries that Americans felt about inflation. And in fact, we now know, because there's this book that's coming out by a couple of New York Times reporters, that the White House was getting some internal polling data, I think as early as spring of 2021, suggesting that the public was quite worried about inflation, and they kind of dismissed it. I think because they thought it would be transitory, the issue would be over. And then, towards the end of the summer, early fall, you saw the Biden administration make comment. You saw Biden basically say, "I feel your pain. I know it's unfortunate that prices are going up, but we're doing something about it." They wanted to celebrate their wins on the on the job market, but also not seem tone deaf, and so therefore acknowledge the pain that people were feeling at the pump and at the grocery store and elsewhere. But then they didn't really do very much. Now, to be fair, there's not that much that a president can do. It's really up to the Fed. Like I said, the main tool is interest rates. It's really up to the Fed to deal with this. And the Fed, I think, was, in retrospect, much too slow. But there were some things that the administration could have done to help with these issues, like, repealing some of the Trump-era tariffs, for example, that when Trump put them in place, Democrats went crazy saying these are terrible. This is self-sabotage. Why are you hurting American companies? Because there was all this retaliation that happened as well. Why are you hurting American consumers who are paying the cost of these tariffs, et cetera? And then when Biden came into office, for some reason, he really dragged his feet on removing those tariffs. Now, those weren't obviously the primary cause of inflation, but it was a thing he could have done to help bring steel costs down, lumber costs down, things like that, things that were contributing to why it had become so expensive to build a house, for example, or to manufacture a washing machine. And I think part of the reason why he didn't do some of those things is that they have all these other, political constituencies that they have to worry about, obviously. And I think there just wasn't that much of a worry about
Right. The awareness
inflation.
wasn't quite there yet.
Right.
I mean, I remember as a young financial reporter in the early 1980s covering the stagflation era, inflation is a political death sentence. If it happens on your watch, it was one of the things that really hurt Jimmy Carter in 1980. So while we're on the subject of government spending, the Build Back Better proposal is dead. There may be elements of it that get revived this year, but it's dead largely because Joe Manchin thinks that, among other things, there's a problem with the deficit. Do you agree? Is he right?
I think I'm probably more hawkish than a lot of other people who might consider. I mean, I'm probably broadly considered left of center on many of my policy preferences. I think I'm more of a deficit hawk than many people who might agree with me on a lot of other issues. But I'm not worried about Build Back Better contributing, or what the bill formerly known as Build Back Better contributing to the deficit. It was mostly paid for through various kinds of tax increases, amongst other issues. And it also included a lot of major investments that I think I'm comfortable not paying for. So things like lifting kids out of poverty, or investing in climate. Those are things that I think are worth taking on more debt for, as opposed to more consumption-oriented government spending. We did a lot of spending in response to COVID, much of which I think was necessary. As I said, I think by the end, there was a lot of bloat. and even some of the dollars that got appropriated early on under Trump, in retrospect, ended up getting stolen or otherwise. There's all these stories about the PPP loans going to fraudulent companies and things like that. So there was a lot of spending that was wasteful. At the time, it seemed like, look, the sky was falling. We needed to do what we could to prevent a global depression, effectively, coming out of this pandemic. But given where we are today, given that we did run up debts as much as we did, I think the financially responsible thing was something comparable to a Build Back Better type program. Now, the problem with the structure of Build Back Better, there were so many different iterations of it. So I guess I need to be clear about what version I'm talking about. The idea of spending a fair amount of money, investing in kids, investing in climate, things like that, if paid for, or even if only mostly paid for, I think was a good idea. Part of the problem with Build Back Better, and where I think Manchin was actually quite right and unfairly maligned about, is that the way the bill was structured was that rather than prioritizing a few different programs that Democrats wanted to do well, fully fund, put in place permanently, it had like these weird sunsetting timelines where the child tax credit expansion, I think, was only for a year in the end. Child care was like 2 or 3 years. I'm trying to remember what some of the other elements were that had these weird time frames. And that was that was for budgeting gimmick purposes.
Right.
So they were essentially claiming the revenues that they were raising through higher taxes in perpetuity, or at least through the 10-year budget window. But then those 10 years of money that were being collected to pay for stuff were only paying for like 1 or 2 years of program. And in that, if that had been the case and those programs had been continued, I think it would have been a real problem for deficits and debt, particularly since there doesn't seem to be the political will to raise other kinds of taxes. I mean, already what the Democrats were talking about was raising taxes on a very, very tiny sliver of the population. There's all this talk about like we should have more of a robust safety net like much of Europe has. But if you look at the structure of those safety net programs in Europe, they also have much higher taxes than we do. America, there's this myth that Americans are overtaxed. In fact, we have very low taxes as a share of GDP. And so that's part of the reason why we have, we run this enormous deficit every year. So if you want to have programs that are like those in Europe, whether we're talking about universal child care or more generous healthcare subsidies, or some of these other kind of cradle to grave safety net services, you probably need to make the case for raising taxes to pay for that stuff. And there was this sleight of hand going on that I think Manchin called out. And as annoyed by him as I am on some of his other policy stances, I think that was a legitimate complaint that Democrats never really addressed. What they should have done is pay for everything, but be upfront about how the program was actually expected to work. Not like have it expire after 2 years and then in 2 years assume it was going to get extended, but then not have a dedicated revenue source for it.
Right. So I'd love to get to immigration. I know it's a topic that you've written a lot about, you know a lot about, and you care a lot about it. I've hoped for a long time that we could have a rational discussion about immigration in this country, and yet we don't seem to be very close to it right now when you have the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, essentially snarling the supply chain in his state and costing his state billions of dollars over a political stunt. So what would a rational discussion of immigration actually look like?
I think, first of all, everyone needs to acknowledge what the actual facts on the ground are, what the data show on immigration. There is this perception right now, unfounded in my view, or in the view of the facts, that America has been overrun by immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, but also legal immigrants in the past few years. And that is just blatantly false. If you look at new immigration, the inflows of people coming into this country, foreign-born people coming into this country, to define our terms, it's gone down by 2/3 since Trump first took office. And that's partly because of policy decisions that he made, primarily targeting legal immigration. I always need to emphasize this because people believe that Trump went after the illegals, to use the epithet that he preferred, undocumented people who were here without authorization. That's really not true. Most of his policies were targeted at legal immigrants. The people that he and other people on the right who are aligned with him have said, get in line, do it the right way, apply to come here. Those were the people he was not letting in. Trump built a wall, but he built it out of paperwork primarily by making it almost impossible for people to come here legally, either by kind of like booby trapping immigration applications so that there was no way to get it right. Like I wrote a series of pieces maybe 2 or 3 years ago about how if you didn't have a middle name, your application would be rejected for various kinds of immigration forms. Like, for example, if you were applying for asylum, because they had developed this new internal guidance that every blank on the form had to be filled out. And if it wasn't, your application would be rejected. But they didn't tell people that. People were just getting rejected and they didn't know why. And if you didn't have a middle name, which a lot of people don't, there was just no way to see yourself out of this sort of Kafkaesque system. So that's just one example. But there were a lot of policy changes that, again, deliberately made it harder for people to come here legally. And then, of course, you had COVID, which whoever was president, whatever their view towards immigration, favorable or otherwise, that would have reduced immigration levels because consulates shut down, borders closed for public health reasons, et cetera. But the Trump administration really took advantage and said, this is our excuse to shut down every kind of immigration possible, even those that don't present a public health risk. Like there was a period of time when Trump said we're not letting in like the following however many categories of, again, legal immigrants or their family members on national security grounds because they will jeopardize the job market. And that was affecting like the children of immigrants who were already here, who had, gone back to India or wherever to visit grandma. They were locked out of the country. They had no way of coming back in. Obviously, a 7-year-old is not a threat to an American job,
Right.
even if you buy the logic. So, yeah, go on. Sorry, I'm
that's
ranting.
okay. I'm sorry to interrupt, but what I was getting to is Trump was making the argument, and Stephen Miller, his aide, who was so interested in this issue, was making the argument that we're being overrun, they're taking your jobs. But isn't actually the opposite true? Isn't it actually the case that we don't have enough workers right now?
Definitely right now. There are widespread labor shortages through a lot of different industries. I mean, even before the pandemic, there were certain industries or occupations where it was very hard to find sufficient numbers of American workers. I'm thinking the tech industry, for example. There are a lot of foreign-born workers who end up working at places like Google or Apple or elsewhere, in part because there are not enough Americans who major in those STEM fields that those companies are looking for. So this predates the pandemic, but it's obviously gotten worse and much more widespread since the pandemic. It's not just tech, right? It's agriculture, it's food services, it's healthcare. There are a lot of immigrants who work in healthcare and they haven't been able to come here. So we have these labor shortages today. Almost every like survey of small businesses that you see will complain about it. And the flip answer maybe a year ago was, well, just pay your workers more. And there's some, truth to that. Like, okay, you want to get more workers, pay them more. But wages have been going up. They've been going up a lot. Mm-hmm. And we still have these worker shortages. And it's partly because people retired early or parents had difficulty dealing with, virtual schooling, juggling virtual schooling and keeping their job, or et cetera. Some of those factors have abated. Some of the retirees have gone back to work. Some of the parents have gone back to work. But we still have fewer people in the labor force than we did before the pandemic. And a big part of the reason why is that we had this like missing cohort of legal immigrants who were never able to come here. And there's these huge backlogs of paperwork for people who are applying to come here under various kinds of visa programs, or even for people who are already here who need to get their work permits renewed periodically, unless you have a green card. And even then, you do need to do something basically to make sure your paperwork is in order. But I think it's like every 10 years. For most categories of lawful immigrants who have work authorization, they need to get their work permit renewed maybe like every 2 years, I think, if you're an asylum seeker, for example. So those people who are already here, they're already working, they are waiting for their renewal documents to be processed. And because the government is so backed up, again, partly because of COVID, partly because the legal immigration system was kind of gutted under Trump and Stephen Miller, those applications are never getting renewed, or at least they're waiting for people are waiting for a year in some cases to get their paperwork renewed, and they are losing their jobs because their paperwork expires. And I've talked to some of them. I've talked to their employers who are like, this person's a good worker, this person's a doctor or a nurse. Or I talked to a woman who worked at McDonald's, another industry, food services, that has had a shortage of workers. They don't want to lose these people. But the government is so dysfunctional that they're losing them. So I think I was talking about what are the things that the Biden administration could do, like what is kind of the low-hanging fruit in terms of helping inflationary pressures, even if their tools are relatively modest. One of them involves trade, another one involves just getting the immigration system more functional, the legal immigration system. I'm not talking about broader immigration reform, which I think also needs to happen, but that requires Congress, and I'm not holding my breath for them to pass anything. But there are things that the Biden administration could do, I'm told is working on, there may be an announcement this week, to try to expedite that processing, or at least give people kind of like more of a bridge between when their paperwork expired and what they do in this limbo period. Like, can they continue working? Can you auto extend paperwork? It's complicated. It's abstract, but it's like these things matter to those individuals and their families, and also to employers and the customers of those employers who are having to pay higher prices because there are all of these problems with not enough workers and supply chains.
Right. And Wisconsin's an example where we have dairy farms that employ immigrants and have for years, and we have small factories and small towns that are aging and could use an influx of new labor. But my sense is that the Biden administration has been a little wary to wade too deeply into this. They seem a little slow on the uptake on solving these immigration issues. Am I wrong about that? Is it politics? What's going on there?
It's a little unclear to me. On some immigration-related issues, I think they're somewhat scared of their shadow. They're worried about being accused of open borders, of being accused of letting in too many unauthorized immigrants, et cetera. I think part of the issue is the immigration system is legitimately complicated and super confusing. I write about it all the time, and I'm confused frequently, and I have to spend a ton of time figuring out, like, what does the law do? What is this visa? If you are a more casual observer of it, it's very easy to get confused about the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker. They sound like they're synonymous. They're different. Asylum seekers are people who they show up and claim and apply for asylum without advance permission, for example, at the border, or they're already here and they say, I want to be able to, either here on a tourist visa or something, they say, I want to be able to stay. I should be able to qualify for asylum. When we're talking about the border issues, we're primarily talking about, or largely talking about, people who are applying for asylum. Refugees are people who apply while they are abroad. They're not yet within U.S. borders. They get heavily vetted, et cetera. And one good example of the Biden administration being really reluctant to undo some of these Trump policies involved Biden's reluctance to raise the refugee ceiling last year. And what I was told, even though he said he would, and he just never signed the paperwork, at least for several months, he wouldn't. And again, these are heavily vetted people. They're people who are not yet here. There's a system in place that was set up basically after the Holocaust to have an orderly way to resettle people who have been displaced from their homes because they're persecuted for various reasons. Biden was dragging his feet, I was told, in part because they were afraid of the optics. They were afraid people were going to confuse refugees with asylum seekers at the border. They were going to hear Biden was letting in refugees and think that what that meant was he tore down the wall at the border and said, y'all come in here, come to Texas and overrun everything. So I think there's this fear that public confusion plus bad faith commentary from the Stephen Millers, et cetera, of the world will make Biden look bad if he does anything on immigration, even if it's in the interests either of our national security interests, our sort of humanitarian moral values interest, or in our economic interests. Because as I said, as we've discussed, there's a real economic need for more of these workers. I think there's this fear that it will play badly, again, that Biden will be accused of open borders. My view is no matter what Biden does, he will be accused of open borders. He will be accused of a border crisis. And we see this right now. There's this debate over what was supposed to be a public health measure called Title 42, which was automatically expelling all asylum seekers at the border, well, everyone at the border, without allowing them to apply for asylum, which is a violation of international law and domestic immigration law. But they said we have to do it because of the pandemic. The pandemic is an emergency, and this requires us to expel everyone. And that's been working its way through the courts, et cetera. And this was a Trump-era policy that Democrats condemned at the time as inhumane and illegal and everything else. And again, it was sort of a pretext for doing what they wanted to do, which was to not allow people to apply for asylum and using public health as an excuse. Now, Biden is finally unwinding that policy, which I think he should have done basically immediately. And there are all of these accusations about how the border is going to be overrun, and we are going to have a surge of people at the border, but it'll probably be more orderly. We'll actually let people apply and say, yes, you pass a credible fear interview, or no, you don't, and we're going to detain you and then bar you from ever coming back. And Democrats are freaking out because they're worried that this action, which, my understanding from talking to lawyers is probably they have to do for legal reasons, and my view is for humanitarian reasons we should be doing as well, that this will reflect badly upon Democrats because because of some combination of people not understanding what it does or whatever, and the optics at the border looking bad. But the thing is, the National Republican Congressional Committee, something like that, sends an email every day and has for more than a year with the subject line Biden's border crisis, right? They have been calling it a border crisis since well before this policy was announced. So there's this great fear that oh no, they're going to say that there's a crisis at the border, but they were saying there was a crisis at the border before. So I would much rather see the Biden administration go on the offense and say, here's why we're adopting these immigration policies, whether it's related to Title 42 or processing of work permits or the refugee system or anything else. Here's our rationale for it. Here's what the law requires. Here's why we think it is or isn't in our economic interest to pursue these policies, why it is or isn't in our national security interest, et cetera, rather than just being so afraid that Fox News was going to control the narrative, because Fox News is going to have its own narrative no matter what they do.
Right. They will say what they're going to say.
Yeah. So I feel like Biden and the Democrats have sort of ceded the issue to Republicans and said, you know what, we'll never be able to win this. Rather than making the case to the public, actually, we need these workers, or actually it's in our national security interest to accept refugees, or whatever, or it's in the interest of, what did Biden always talk about? Restoring the soul of America, of becoming returning to our place as a moral leader in the world and accepting the world's persecuted. Again, with vetting and all of the rest. We're the richest country in the world. We can afford to take in more than, I forget how many refugees we took last year, but it was like 11,000 or something. It was the lowest in history.
Right.
We should be able to do more, and we have a number of compelling self-interested reasons to do more, as well as, in my view, some moral obligations to do more. And they're just like scared of their shadows, and they don't really want to talk about it.
So, somewhat related, populism has really gripped the Republican Party in particular over the last few years, and we're seeing some payback to corporations, most notably in Florida right now, where Governor Ron DeSantis, your old state, is basically taking on Mickey Mouse and his employer. And you wrote about a year ago, and I wanted to just quote from this column, that Democrats had a once-in-a-generation opportunity to rebrand themselves as the party of economic growth and opportunity. And yet, I'm not sure they've done that. What's happened there, and why have they missed that opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Republicans used to be the party of free markets, have government get out of the way. It's the Democrats who choose the winners and losers. We think the market should decide. That was kind of the narrative amongst Republicans, and that went out the window with Trump to a certain extent, right? He was very interventionist on a number of economic issues. He talked about how he was the great deregulator, but he did he put in place a lot of regulations that impeded market functioning. Yes, he made it easier for companies for coal companies to put arsenic in your water. That was a deregulatory action that he took. I'm not sure that a lot of economic growth resulted from that one. But, he also made it much more difficult for employers to hire the workers that they wanted if they were not US born, for example. He launched punitive measures against private companies that he perceived to be political enemies, whether those were media companies, and there were a number of cases like that. So I'm touched by some of them personally in the sense, or indirectly, I guess, in the sense that like he was really mad at the Washington Post. The Washington Post is personally owned by Jeff Bezos, who's the founder of Amazon. So Trump did a bunch of things to try to exact revenge against Amazon, saying that the Postal Service should raise the rates that they charge Amazon. He tried to allegedly block Amazon from getting a very lucrative government contract, things like that. There were also reports that one of the other companies that I work for, CNN, which was, as everyone knows, frequently a source of ire for former President Trump, that was the reason why antitrust authorities within the Trump administration were trying to block the then proposed merger between AT&T and Time Warner, which owned CNN. Now, there might have been other reasons to oppose that merger, but Trump wanted to block it to punish CNN. He, I think it was the Justice Department under him, launched an antitrust investigation against the auto companies that said that they did not like the auto emission standards that the Trump administration had put in place. So there were a lot of examples of things like this, where Trump was using the levers of state power to try to punish enemies and sometimes reward friends. And again, historically, that's not what the Republican Party claimed to be about. Since then, and at the time, there was a little bit of resistance from some, sort of traditional conservative free market Republicans, but eventually they shrugged it off. And since then, there have been all these copycats like DeSantis, like Abbott, trying to use, in those cases, Abbott, the governor of Texas, their state authority to punish private companies that they don't like. Now, you mentioned the piece that I wrote last year where I was saying, like, there was an opportunity for the private sector to realign, or at least one economist put it this way, like rebalance their political portfolio away from Republicans who they had historically been very closely aligned with, through political donations and otherwise. The Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, big industry groups like that, and individual companies had been closely aligned with Republicans. But in this new state of the world where, state power was being wielded to reward friends and punish enemies. And Trump did a bunch of other things that were sort of along those lines, some of which were justified by his peculiar economic worldview, like the trade wars, also not good for business. That was more about, he thought that he was punishing China and like many of our allies as well for confusing reasons. But, ostensibly that was not about hurting Americans. He was just confused about that. But either way, not good for private businesses in the United States. That was an opportunity for Democrats to sort of fill in the void and say, okay, we're going to be the pro-economy, pro-growth, maybe even pro-business party. And maybe we'll get some political donations that some of these private businesses are no longer giving to Republicans. But maybe also, we'll change our branding with the public. We're not the socialists anymore. We're about figuring out how to make markets work for people and for companies. And there were a number of other things that, the Democrats sort of considered doing last year that were good or did do last year that were good ultimately for the economy, like promoting vaccination. That was, in my view, one of the most important things for the economic recovery was the fact that we finally had a way to make it less likely for people to get COVID, which meant fewer disruptions to various kinds of markets. In any event, Democrats did not take my advice. And rather than rebranding themselves as the new pro-economy, pro-growth, even pro-business party, they have also doubled down on much of this. Oh, sorry, my cat has decided to join us. If you hear him. They also kind of double down on this populist rhetoric and often very punitive rhetoric about companies. Now, their logic is a little bit different. They want to punish companies for corporate greed, not because they're in favor of LGBT rights or whatever, which is sort of the case in Florida. They have a different rationale for wanting to punish companies, but they are also trying to present themselves as the party that's really hard on private business, which I just, I don't think is a productive way to either help the economy or to necessarily win over political support. A lot of this is coming out of their desire to be seen as doing something about inflation. Like I said, there are a number of complicated factors contributing to higher price pressures recently, some of which are related to policy choices that Democrats made. Rather than kind of acknowledging the downsides of running the economy hot, but saying, look, they were justified. It's okay. We know we ran the economy hot and we had high prices, but we also got these really good things like we had a faster job recovery than people expected. And we didn't have the same kind of economic scarring from long spells of unemployment that we saw after the Great Recession, et cetera. Rather than making that argument, they're saying, no, our policies had nothing to do with this. The main reason why inflation is so high is corporate greed and all of those, greedy companies, oil companies and otherwise, who are exerting their market power, which somehow they didn't have, when the economy was cratering, when corporate profits were going down and oil was negative briefly in 2020. Somehow they weren't as greedy then, or they didn't have as much market power then. I don't know how that works out. Today, they're very greedy. They have all this market power, and we need to punish them through antitrust, through punitive taxes, through all these other things. And so I think it's like Democrats, they want to tap into that populist vibe that has taken over both the left and right. And they're really keen to find a villain that they can blame for the thing American voters are most mad about, which is inflation. And that has however sympathetic they might have been to the argument I was making a year ago for them to rebrand themselves as like the pro-economy, pro-growth, pro-business party. If they were ever sympathetic to it then, I don't know that they were. They're definitely not now, because they see corporate America as too valuable of a villain, frankly. Because then they can cast themselves as the hero. The problem is, all of the policies, to the extent that they have any policies, that are guided by this rhetoric, they're either going to be ineffective at best and potentially actively harmful at worst. Like some of these punitive policies, for example, the windfall profits tax. If you think profiteering is the reason why gas prices are high, then maybe it sounds reasonable to say, okay, we're going to put a tax on windfall profits for oil companies. But in fact, we tried a windfall profits tax before I think it was passed in the late 70s, early 80s. And the way it's structured, it actually discourages more oil output. And
Right.
we need more oil output right now.
Discourages investment. Yeah.
Pardon?
Discourages investment. Exactly.
Right. And so again, this is the kind of thing that like sounds good. It gets people real riled up. They're like, I hate those oil companies. They're making so much money. It's not fair. And I agree. I'm not sympathetic to that. Like, I'm not saying poor oil companies. That's why we shouldn't put this tax on them. Like, it's not like I like the oil companies. I think they're making a lot of money. But if you want to solve the problem of inflation or high gas prices, at least in the near term, then you need to encourage more investment, and this does the opposite.
I think we're going to have to leave it there, and we are going to count on you, Catherine Rampell, to keep giving advice to both parties, and maybe they'll listen.
That they'll keep ignoring it, I'm sure.
As always, and we so appreciate your time, because these issues are complicated and they don't get presented as complicated issues in the political lens, but it's important that all of us try to understand them. So appreciative of your time tonight. You've been watching a special program sponsored by the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and the Follette School of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We've been chatting with Catherine Rampell, an economics columnist for the Washington Post. Thanks for joining us. And don't forget, you can still sign up for the forum, the spring forum, that's on Wednesday. Just go to go.wisc.edu/LaFollette Forum. And thank you for your time tonight. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you.